Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we've got Julia Cowley with us and Dr. Brian Santana to discuss the JonBenét Ramsey note. Julia, I don't think you need an introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. She is the host of The Consult, but she's most notably an FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit member. And I hope everyone knows Dr. Brian Santana, the true crime professor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. So, Julia, I wanted to talk with you about this note. I've listened to your show back in 2023 where you covered it. And I know that you're probably one of the few people that have actual training in this type of work. When you first read this note, can you talk about, just some of the things that stood out to you about it?
Sure. I don't know what I remember from when I first read it, like many, many years ago, but I
knew
do
you read
remember
it in a training, according
Yes,
to one of your
yes. So
podcasts.
yeah, that's what I'm going to refer back to, is I don't really remember when I first read it, but I know I read it many times even before this training. But I had a training. This is before I was in the behavioral analysis unit, and I was taking a forensic linguistics class being taught down at the FBI's BAU by trained profilers. And one of the exercises in class was we were talking about the note and analyzing the note. And I just had a different opinion, I think, than the instructor had regarding the note. And one of the things that stood out to me was, in reading it, there's some language that comes across as feminine. It's nurturing, it's caring. And people have interpreted that to be that these are feminine characteristics and therefore potentially a feminine author. But my concern at the time, my question was, well, much of the note is taken from movies and lines from movies, which the speaker of those lines were male characters. So how can you necessarily say that this is a female author? Maybe they're feminine characteristics, and maybe somebody's drawing from, a character. So therefore they're choosing feminine lines to say because they are indeed feminine. I mean, that could be an argument for that. But I guess my point was, how can you attribute characteristics to this particular author if they're borrowing lines from somebody else entirely? And, there's a reason they're choosing those lines. And maybe it is because they're a feminine author or they have feminine characteristics. Doesn't necessarily mean they're a female. But that was one of my questions, So I think that was my first impression, that this whole note is a lie. And can we really believe anything? And can we draw true characteristics of the author of this note? Can we draw those from this note itself, if it's all based on a lie or if it's copied from someone else?
Yeah, in what you're saying about the quotes from the movie, I think that is that definitely stands out to me. But what stands out to me the most is the length. And I've got questions about when this was actually written. Was this written before the murder or after the murder? You know what? Why don't we, before we get into that, let's just go ahead and read through the note. I've got a copy of it right here. So, Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction, which that right there just kind of draws some red flags, right? I mean, it sounds like how ChatGPT would kind of start something if it was allowed to write you a ransom note, right?
Or the movie Die Hard for action movies.
Yeah, exactly. We've already got one comment about that.
Yeah,
We
it's very
respect the
Hans
business.
Gruber-ish or whatever his the bad guy. That's how it
I
comes
gotta show
across
you
right
this.
off the
That
bat.
was the,
Hans
yeah,
Gruber, yeah.
he got it, right on the money on that. And I think when you start out like that too, with this kind of cinematic approach of you represent a small foreign faction, I mean, that, you know.
Yeah. And one thing I wanna point out about any kind of anonymous communication, even the point is to remain anonymous. So when you're starting out, especially and you mentioned how long this was, you're starting out strong, right? You're in your attempt to disguise who you are. So you're throwing in all these things, and maybe you're trying to disguise your writing. You're throwing in these what we call contraindicators, for example, saying we instead of I, those types of things. But as you go along and you're writing your letter, you get tired. So you start to, just generally, fall back into your normal handwriting, fall back into your regular habits, fall back into your real feelings. So that's how I interpret, this is how it starts. Starts strong with I'm going to remain anonymous. I'm going to disguise who I am. I'm going to disguise my feelings. I'm going to disguise my real motive for writing this letter. But as I go on, those things I'm going to get tired as I go on, especially in such a long letter. It's not really a note, it's a letter. And
Right.
go on, then I think the true motives, the true personality, that kind of their true feelings start to leak out. It's just harder because they get tired.
How do you differentiate the true feelings here? And I'm thinking about when the tone or kind of word choice is adopted from these other sources or seems to kind of nod back towards them. What are the kind of indicators you look for? I mean, you mentioned the kind of fatigue that might set in, but getting back to that place of authenticity when we don't really have a reference point, like how do you know what that moment is? And those later places are not necessarily just a contraindicator as you were describing it.
Well, I think you just have to take it in its totality
Mhm.
and at least start off thinking, okay, this is probably all, the beginning is probably a lie.
Mhm.
And from there, from what we know about anonymous letter writers or anonymous note writers, they tend to leak out information. So I think just generally the structure of the letter can kind of indicate to you what is most likely real, what is most likely not real. And I think to us, that seemed apparent as the letter went on. And then, we were trying to look at this letter kind of within the four corners of the page, as opposed to drawing in what we know about the crime. But it's really hard to set aside what we actually knew about the crime,
Mhm.
what had occurred. And so you do have to fit the letter into that as well
Mhm.
and try to decide, too, what the motive could be after this particular crime was committed.
Mhm.
Yeah, as far as like a motive to write the letter, would just stalling the investigation and the search for, I would assume that would be.
That is a very valid motive. Yes.
And the other one I thought of is that if this guy broke into the house early on in the day, I believe they left the house at 4:30 and they came back around like 9:30 to 10 o'clock.
That
So
sounds about
rough
right. Yeah.
estimate, right?
Mhm.
Um, but either way, if he broke in even midway through the night, he's got a few hours to kill and he's in a 7,200 square foot house. And that would give him plenty of time to, go through the rooms, go through people's stuff, maybe even find a letter about the 118,000. And I think that, besides kind of finding a place where he wants to take JonBenét, I didn't know if that was time that he spent writing this. And that's why, he made up such a, um, just the cinematic, just fake story with movie quotes. I
Mhm.
would think, and maybe this is just me thinking like a rational person, that if I
Mhm.
killed someone, I would be wanting to get out of the house or wanting to clean up. My focus would not be sitting down and writing a letter, and not just writing a letter. We know that he started to write a letter, and this is draft number 2 that we have.
Yeah, I think there's another draft as well. I think this might be even 3.
So 3 drafts.
Mhm.
I meant, I'm assuming he's spending at least half an hour if he's writing fast.
I think someone sat down and wrote it out to see how long it would take, but it's a significant amount of time. And yeah, a person who is rational and not a criminal and didn't just kill a child would think, I got to get out of here. I need to clean up. Like you said, I need to distance myself as quickly as possible. But if you're dealing with a sadistic murderer, then they might not want that to end. Like, this was a pleasurable experience for them. They want to continue that. And so therefore you write this letter, which continues their sadistic fantasy. And not only that, it also is an opportunity, if you're going with this theory, to further hurt the Ramseys, and specifically John Ramsey. So, but that's a question a lot of people have
Right.
asked Cameron about who or what's the timing of writing this letter? Was it done before or after her murder? I wasn't so sure after talking with my colleague Bob on the show. I came around to thinking I think it was written after the murder. And this was a way to prolong the offender's sadistic fantasies. And there is a line in the letter that I think is curious that makes me think, well, I think there's a lot of indications in the letter that the person has already killed her, because there's a lot of convincing language to try to make us believe she's still alive and that she can be saved. It's over the top convincing. But let me find if I can.
And you know what this kind of reminds me of is, and maybe it doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but when you were on the show last time and we're talking about the Golden State Killer, and we're talking about that part of his fantasy, or what he got off on, was being inside the house, dominating. That's why he chose houses that he knew that the male was inside, and that he would kind of dominate that situation, place, dishes on their back, which is really an unnecessary step if your intent is to rape and kill someone.
Right.
Right? Like,
and it's an unnecessary, again, to spend so much time in a home. And I think that's what a lot of people have trouble understanding is, why on earth would this person spend so much time in the home and sit down after committing this murder and write a note? That they have to be comfortable in the home, which I agree. But a lot of people equate that with it's the Ramseys, because nobody would do something like that. But when we look at it, if we look at this crime as being committed by a sadistic killer, murderer, sexual murderer, then it does make sense that he would stay extra time in the home, because there is a very strong correlation, like you said, we talked about this before, between burglary and sexual aggression. And burglary, a lot of serial sexual killers have been burglars, going into people's homes prior to ever committing murders. And there's also a lot of research that suggests it can be very sexually gratifying. You don't even have to commit a murder for this to be exciting and gratifying for the offender. So in that context, it makes a lot of sense why he would spend all this extra time in the house. Now, if you look at it the reverse, that this is an accident or somebody didn't mean to do this, then they would want to get out as quickly as possible. So somebody, therefore, who doesn't get out quickly as possible must live there and must have committed the murder themselves. And I think that is the other interpretation.
And as part of the actual, the amount of time that people have spent poring over this letter and reading it in different ways, even the class that you kind of mentioned, and the different interpretations that people came up with, is that awareness of this kind of like this pastiche that he's like created of this patchwork of different things from movie quotes and other things? Is that part of the actual prolonging the pleasure as well? Knowing that not only as an act of like practical misdirection, but also the sense that people will be kind of working to assign meaning and decipher this?
Brian, you
I
broke
don't
up a little
know.
bit.
Yeah, you did break up just a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your question. Like, is um, the effort that he put into these movie quotes and stuff like that part of the fun of having people decipher this or figure out what it is or what it really means? I'm not sure he put that much thought into it. I think it's just part of his fantasy. There's definitely a kidnapping fantasy element to this whole letter. And I think it was more his fantasy as opposed to he thought that far along. I think his ultimate goal was to, number one, prolong his fantasy. Number two, do that by hurting John Ramsey. And I don't know that he thought much more than that when he sat down and wrote this letter. But there's one thing I just wanted to point out before I forget, just about what stood out to me as another possible indication besides the attempts to convince us that she's still alive and that she can be saved. But it's well, I have it as line between lines 50 and 55 at some point, but he does, or the author does, write something about of getting her back as opposed to writing getting her back alive. And I thought it was interesting that he left off the word alive in that particular sentence. And I think that's because he already knew subconsciously she's dead. So that was probably one of the things that made me think, I think this was written afterwards and that she's not alive anymore. And he also is pretty vague when he talks about how he's going to kill her. So it makes me again think it's already done and he has no plan in the future to kill her if he doesn't get what he wants because she's already dead. So those are the kinds of things that make me believe this was probably written after.
What do you think about the 118,000 that he mentions, where he says you will withdraw 118,000 from your account, 100,000 will be in $100 bills, the remaining 18,000 in $20 bills? Why does he give a shit? Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. I know that you've spoken about using the attaché. What do you how do you think he found out that information about the 118,000? And do you put any significance beside using attaché instead of a duffel bag, or why that's even in there?
I think the amount was purposeful. I think the offender knew that that amount would mean something to John Ramsey because it was his prior year's bonus. And how that person knows, I don't know. I don't think it's just from being in the house and maybe seeing it on documentation in his office, although that was possible. That is very possible that could have happened. I think it's because he knows John Ramsey and he knew that that was the amount of bonus. And I think it was purposely put in there as a message to John Ramsey. I don't think it was accidental. I don't think it was subconscious in any way. I think it was purposeful. And the use of the word attaché, and my colleagues may have different viewpoints, but I just think it was a way to sound foreign or sophisticated, like a sophisticated kidnapper of some sort. And It was also used in another movie, I believe.
When you're analyzing notes, is there how much weight do you give to the content like we've discussed, thinking about things like the word choice or the tone or style versus the literal handwriting that is done?
So I don't look at handwriting, and I'm not an expert in handwriting analysis, so I don't necessarily, other than, at the beginning of this letter, it appears the person's trying to disguise their writing by being a little sloppier or shaky, and that kind of dissipates as the letter goes on. But to be able, for me to be able to compare writing, I can't do it. Only experts can do it, and they have to have significant amount of training, and they have to have the original documentation. So anyone who has seen the experts that have come out in the media to talk about this letter, none of them have actually analyzed the original document, which is necessary. I did take forensic document examination when I was in graduate school. Didn't make me an expert, but the one thing I did learn is you have to have the original. Can't do it from a photocopy.
Yeah.
And then when we analyzed the actual words in the statement, I'm also not a forensic linguist. So I have limited ability to analyze like sentence structures and how things are said or how things are put together, or I can recognize some patterns here and there, but I could never, like, for example, I could never say or do an authorial attribution saying by looking at one person's handwriting and saying, okay, this person wrote that. I do not have the qualifications to do that. What we did do is just do a behavioral analysis of this letter. So not handwriting analysis, not forensic linguistics, but just a behavioral analysis. And what did we think the person was trying to say? What was the point of the letter? Those types of things, all the behavior stuff that we do.
So this
But
actually,
we did do a little, I should say we did do a little linguistics. Like we noticed the changing of the pronouns, there's a lot of inconsistencies in this letter. And we noticed those types of things. And when you have all those inconsistencies, it's not genuine. That this is not, it's obvious. It's not a real ransom note. We know that. Just throw that aside. But there's a lot of inconsistencies in this letter. So we did notice those types of things. And we noticed at the beginning, there were some certain words that were misspelled. But as the letter goes on, they don't misspell other, words. They clearly did that on purpose. Again, another contraindicator.
So they're misspelling words on purpose. They're,
I think
using
so.
movie quotes. And then they're throwing in these other details. Like the whole, I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I know
that's from
was
movies.
from Harry, Dirty Harry,
Yeah,
right?
they took from Dirty Harry. They took from Ruthless People. What else? There was another one. Speed.
Right.
Several movies, all kind of kidnapping, bad guy movies type. Yeah, they drew a lot. Not necessarily the exact quotes, but the general themes and principles from those movies that are so similar. You can't just say it was a coincidence. They saw these movies.
And we're familiar with them enough that they were just kind of there. And given that when this note came out, I mean, these were also big movies. These aren't like obscure these aren't obscure films, really. I mean, are you imagining that they would expect people, at least at the time the letter was originally found, to kind of pick up on these references?
I don't know, but I would think they would have, particularly the Dirty Harry and the Speed one. Don't attempt to grow a brain. Although some people didn't know what that meant, I think. But yeah, there's some pretty obvious things that if you'd seen these movies, you would know right away. I don't think you would catch every movie reference in here. I didn't, but after doing research, and then I went and watched those particular scenes of the movies, and I'd seen all the movies. I just had to go rewatch some things and some, just to make sure and look at the language that was used in the movie versus the language in the letter. And it's like they're definitely referencing many different movies.
Do you think that the age of the person is you can derive that from the movies used? Like, for example, with Dirty Harry, would that be, I would think that would be an older person as to opposed to a newer movie like Speed or Ransom that came out around that time frame.
Well, here's the trouble I have with that, because Dirty Harry was such a popular movie. I don't know that it necessarily means you have to be older to have seen it. It was so popular. It was on TV. I had seen it even as a young kid. So I don't know if that makes a person older. I think I forget what age we were thinking. I mean, somewhere between like 25 and 45-ish is probably where we came down on age. Age can be difficult to assess because you have chronological age and then you have emotional age as well. But I mean, I wouldn't put this person too young. But I also wouldn't necessarily say they have to be older because they were familiar with Dirty Harry, because it was on TV a lot. It was widely known. Famous quotes come from that movie that I think a lot of people know, and they may never have even seen the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of, you're reciting these from memory, and I completely agree that those are, memorable quotes or memorable scenes that may have stuck in your head while you're writing this. It just amazes me that your adrenaline is, or I shouldn't say that, most people's adrenaline would be up, whether you're, in someone's house waiting to murder someone, or you've just murdered someone and you're sitting down and writing this. And you're, essentially writing a creative story, because all this is fiction for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I bet for this person, their adrenaline was up for them. Yeah, this was probably very exciting for them.
But thinking very clearly, not desperation, like you said in that way, right? But thinking
I
clearly.
don't find it. Yeah, I don't find this to be a note of desperation.
Have you, when you studied this letter, did you think about was this letter ever talked about, let's say, in your work at the FBI, or maybe in other conversations you've had in relation to other, let's say, high profile child cases? Is there any point of reference, like to think about this letter in relation to, that might be helpful?
The only high profile case I can think of is the Lindbergh kidnapping. I'm not sure we ever talked about it like in a professional setting. This is just my own thought. The Lindbergh killing, that was a pretty short kidnapping note in comparison. And most communications, threatening communications or ransom notes, tend to be on the shorter side, not this long. That's just general. That's just kind of anecdotal, really, as opposed to actual statistics that I have available to me. But I would think that the average ransom note is much shorter than this. But statistically, I don't know how much shorter, or how, this would be an anomaly. But again, I don't have statistics to reference.
So when we go to the third paragraph and he's talking about, I'll just read it, any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will be denied her remains for a proper burial. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Is it me reading into this, or is he trying to imply that it's someone else that doesn't like John and not necessarily him? kind of.
Yeah, it's an inconsistency because he starts off, we respect your business. It just, as I was talking about, you talk about the handwriting that you can't keep up the facade of that in such a long letter. He can't keep his feelings. So he starts out, we respect your business, and he's trying to be respectful at first, Mr. Ramsey, and it ends where he's almost mocking him at the end, where I believe his true feelings come out. So I think this is, again, just the signs of that inconsistency in this author, and he's starting to reveal potentially his true feelings. And of course, there's not somebody else watching over her. It's, she is dead at this point, in my opinion, and he knows that John cannot save her. So it's just starting to leak out what's really happening.
During this, and sorry to jump around on you, but
That's okay.
During the we respect your business part, is there any indication to that maybe this person works with John or works in the same field as John? I know that he worked for a Lockheed Martin affiliate. That's not the best word, but he worked in the tech field.
Yes.
Is that when you're looking at something like that, does that give you any indication of that maybe he knows John through work?
Well, I'll tell you, my colleague Bob thought that this person knew John through work. And what I will say to support that theory is that the first thing he does talk about is his business. It comes up really early on. This is a prioritized thought when it comes to this person thinking of John Ramsey. He thinks of John and his business. So first thing, not we have your daughter right off the bat. It's not like that. It's like, I want to talk about your business. We respect your business, but not the country it stands for. And so, yes, I think it is quite possible that this person knew John through business channels.
And not to jump ahead, but I have to. Is there any indication with the SBTC that's Small Business Technology Committee, I believe is what the acronym was? Some people believe.
I don't know. There have been so many theories of what that could possibly mean, and I don't even have a theory. I don't know. But certainly it meant something to the offender. And I think it might just mean nothing. And it's just his way of, again, making it seem like this is coming from some kind of small foreign faction that has a specific ideology of some sort that could be just misleading, or it could really mean something. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's how I kind of feel about the overall theme is when you sit down and you're going through this letter, at least for me, I start going down rabbit holes and start searching things like SBTC and everything else in this letter. And you're spending time doing that. And if your goal is to delay a police response or delay an investigation, that's a more practical way to think of it. Right?
I think that is a part of this, but so what is this letter really trying to do? Just, think of it that way. What you kind of strip away all of the dramatics in the letter. What is the message that this person, not just they're trying to get money, but what is the message he's trying to send to John? The bottom line. And I can answer that too. I'm not trying to trick you.
No, I was taking time to think, but I think a part of this is that he's continuing to control John.
Yes.
Throughout this, with this letter. So it's like the fantasy doesn't end. He's gone and he knows that they're in the house, and I don't know, maybe he's even watching the police show up, and he knows that they're looking at this letter and going through, and you're creating more fear and more stress to John and the family.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. It's a way to control him, but the at the heart of this, what he is doing is he is making John believe his daughter is still alive, that he can save her. And if he doesn't do what he says, it's his fault that she's dead. And it's cruel, it's sadistic, because the whole time, if in my theory, she's dead. So he's basically giving him hope only to take it away. And if you've heard John Ramsey talk, one of the things that he has said, at least I've heard him say, is when his older daughter died in a car accident and he got the phone call that she had died, he said, there was nothing I could do. I felt helpless. There was absolutely nothing I could do. And this letter makes him believe there's something he can do for this daughter. And I think this is kind of, come to me over the years, but I think this person knew how John felt about when he couldn't save his other daughter, completely out of his control, that situation. She was killed in a car accident, nowhere near him. And I think this person knew that. And this whole letter is designed to make him believe, in this case, he can save her, and it's his fault when he doesn't. And it's cruel and it's sadistic. And how would this person know that they can play into this if they didn't know John? And, this may be something John, he has talked publicly. I don't know before this if he talked about publicly or who he told that story to, but I am sure he shared that with other people about how painful it was that he couldn't save his daughter. And I think this offender knew that. And that's what I see as the bottom line of this letter.
And if we think about that, if that's the bottom line, does that change how we think about the crime as well? So that this becomes, based on what you're saying, a crime where JonBenét is really the conduit for acting out a kind of, of a kind of fantasy or kind of exercising control over John Ramsey, that it's not really about JonBenét, but it's about him. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. Now, I'm not of the opinion that this person killed and sexually abused JonBenét just to get back at John. Mm-hmm. I think you had a combination of somebody who was a sadistic pedophile who had an opportunity to use that as a way not only to fulfill his own sexual fantasies, but also to get back at John.
Yeah, it's gosh, it just blows my mind every time I read this of how many layers there are. And
I see this comment here, and I can't disagree with that either, that it's the primary motive. And I know John Douglas, one of our predecessors in the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, was the behavioral science unit when he was there. I think his opinion was also the same as Jason's, that the primary motive was to harm John.
It just seems to me, and maybe I'm off by this, but that it's not that I don't disagree with you or Jason, but that through the lens I'm looking at, if I hated someone, I wouldn't want to kill them. And I feel like being a pedophile is just a particular low that a lot of people don't go. And especially the way that he killed her just seems to be, I guess, out of bounds in the realm. If the motive was revenge or to hurt John. I mean,
Yeah, I think the primary motive was sexual murder. That's my opinion, not necessarily to hurt John, but I'm saying I have colleague, my predecessor thought that the primary motivator was to get back at John. So I think the primary motivator, it was kind of, as my colleague Bob put it, it was kind of, you know, two things in one, that he could not only live out a sexual fantasy that he had, but it was also a way to hurt John Ramsey. And he, just happened to find a desirable victim in a home he was familiar with. And because he knew John, and this gave him that opportunity.
do you think he had been in the home before?
Yes.
Do you think that was voluntary, or do you think that he broke in?
I think he probably had a legitimate reason to be in the home prior to the homicide, because I think the offender knew the Ramseys. I think he knew John. I don't know how close, but close enough. And I think, like I said, it started out very formal with Mr. Ramsey, but then it ends up, he calls him John. And so it does indicate there's a familiarity with John, even though he starts off so formal. So I do think it's someone who knew him personally.
Well, yeah, and with the layout of that house, again, it's 7,200 square feet. I believe there's 10 doors and 100 windows in the house, and it's 4 floors, but it's stacked really weird. And where she was at in the basement in relation is, you had 3 floors in between her and her parents. So I do agree that, if you are doing this, if you're killing someone, whether she's yelling or not, during this whole process, it's probably at an area in the house where he felt pretty comfortable that he could take his time, right?
Yes. And not only that, not just the size of it, but just being able to maneuver. It was a kind of a maze-like home,
Right.
but like you said, it wasn't a normal layout of a home. It was very expansive, and to navigate that under these circumstances, it would be a surprise to me if he had not been in the home before, and likely for a legitimate reason. And I base that opinion on the fact that I do believe that the person who wrote this note had a familiarity with John, whether it was through work, whether he was an employee of some sort. They did have open houses. So there are just a number of a neighbor potentially, there's just a number of people that had been in and out of that home. There were several keys that had been given out to various people who worked in the home or did odd jobs around the home. So yeah, I think the person had a lot of opportunity. This isn't just a small circle of people. When you say this is someone who's been in the home, it is a large circle. It's not that easy. Like it's just got to be one of these 5 people. No, it was a lot of potentially different people. And I don't believe all those people who might have had access to the home have all been accounted for, DNA taken, that type of thing. I don't know that that has been fully investigated.
Do you think this is a situation where, and I realize that, and I've heard you talk about this in other contexts before with profiling, that people imagine that this is some kind of, it's actually a science, and it's not magic where you could have the answers to everything surrounding this. But I think there is, having access to you on a program like this, there is a temptation just to ask you to go there anyway. Do you have any opinion, at least we can use the word opinion, about whether this was someone who has engaged in these kinds of fantasies beyond just breaking into someone's house, but engaging in sexual assaults before? Or was this someone who had these fantasies, this combination of JonBenét, the fantasy, and this aggression towards the father, just intersected perfectly where this happened? Or is this someone that you think is likely more seasoned and has engaged in maybe other kinds of behaviors that we would, if we knew who this was, we could kind of trace back and see?
I believe before this crime, they likely offended before. To what extent, I don't know that we can say, but I found this, I don't want to say sophisticated, but somewhat sophisticated fantasy. So I would think that they had offended before, and maybe they were never caught, charged. I mean, a lot of these crimes go very underreported, but I would say yes to your question. That's my opinion. I think my colleagues would agree. Colleagues on my show, I should say, because I will tell you, this is a highly debated case, and even, you know, FBI agents and police and other profilers, we just don't all agree.
And I think that's one of the fascinating things about it is, you know, you've got plenty of Facebook groups that all share their opinions. And I feel like, you know, for the most part, it's really hard to cancel one out just because there's so much we don't know about this. And especially when you've got a note like this that's written, you know, majorly on a fantasy. When we're looking at the end of the note and he says, "Don't try to grow a brain, John. You're not the only fat cat around. So don't think that killing will be difficult. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good Southern common sense of yours." Knowing that, I believe John went to West Virginia University.
So I don't believe he's originally from the South, but he does have ties to the South, and obviously being married to Patsy, who was from the South. This person knew that, and maybe they didn't know he wasn't originally from the South, but
They
there's,
just
again,
assumed because of
familiarity.
Patsy.
Maybe, or they're just being sarcastic. It's hard to know, you know, they may not know he was actually originally from Michigan, I believe. He's not from the South originally, but they may have assumed that based on marrying Patsy and where he'd lived prior, and, you know, they had a home in the Atlanta area. So,
That makes sense. So
yeah.
again, that's kind of another tie to knowing John, or I mean, that's also something you can see around the house. If you see diplomas and, you know,
Right. Yeah, you may just gather things just from what you observe when you're in the home or in his office or things like that, or when he talks about, or maybe Patsy says something, and, you know, there's all sorts of ways that an offender can gather intelligence about somebody. But it just goes back to the familiarity that this person has. This isn't a complete stranger to the Ramseys. Now, they may not know the person, but the person knows them.
Do you think it is likely that this individual's name? I was just thinking about the Delphi case and how, Richard Allen's name had come up very early on, but it had been misfiled under, the name had been written down wrong, and the clerk eventually brought this to their attention. Because of just the scope of this case and the prominence of the Ramseys, there were a lot of people who have been interviewed over the years. Do you think that the offender is likely on one of these many lists, whether it's the FBI or local police, and the circumstances just haven't, intersected in a way to kind of bring them to the forefront? Or would you be surprised if this is someone that's just not been on anybody's radar whatsoever, if this individual is caught?
Yeah, I would be surprised if this person's name hasn't come up before and on some list somewhere. Now,
Right.
what I will tell you is at least like some lists are like 600 names.
Right.
There have been so many suspects and names that have come up. So there are a lot, but yeah, it would surprise me if somewhere that this person's name isn't somewhere in the files, somewhere in somebody's file, or in a document somewhere. Yeah, that would surprise me. And if they're not, I still believe that maybe their name was never came up in the investigation, but I believe they will have a connection.
Did the BAU do a formal analysis of this case?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. I just thought of that. I was like, you've done a show on this.
Not that I'm aware
I
of.
wondered, does that count?
Yeah, I don't, at least not during my time. It may have been done in more recent years. At least certain aspects of the case may have been looked at more recently after my time.
So the last part of this victory and SBTC, do you have any comments on that or thoughts?
Other than what I already said, I don't know if that was merely to make it seem like that this was some sort of foreign faction that had a specific ideology, and that's the reason for this whole kidnapping and needing the money, or if those were specific letters that meant something. I just don't know.
Yeah, and so we do agree that this is someone that probably lives in the area, just to address this comment, and knows John and the family, like you're saying.
Well, so I see that. I mean, that's a good question, because if they did, I'm not going to say they necessarily lived right in Boulder, but if they did live outside of Boulder, they've been there before. They've been to Boulder before, likely been to this house before. So even if they traveled from out of town or out of state, they wouldn't just come there just to commit the crime. They've been there for other reasons, likely work-related reasons, personal reasons. So they're going to have a connection to Boulder, whether they live there or not.
Would it be a fair assumption?
These are all just my opinion.
No, but we love to put your
just
opinion.
a caveat, that. And
I know that you're really, you don't like going on the limb a lot, which is funny because the last show, remember how we had the 10 bodies for the Long Island serial killer that I asked you about, and you're like, no, I can't commit to him being responsible for all 10. And I was thinking, what's the odds that 10 bodies?
There we go.
Yeah, and come to find out.
Turns out one of them's not, right?
Yeah,
At least
two.
now, like we
Yeah,
can't.
two. Yeah.
And that, and I'm not saying that like probability wise, they likely all are connected, but it turned out they're not. And I think that's why we were saying, we can't link all of these together at this point because we don't have enough evidence to. And just saying what are the chances is not good enough evidence for us, because we have seen those odd cases. We just did a case from the 1990s of missing and murdered women in Grand Rapids. And there was a suspected serial killer who's been tied to one of the murders in Grand Rapids and another one out of Maryland. And he's since passed away. And most of the victims, there's not forensic evidence, but what we have is we have a known location where they disappeared from, the way their bodies were all dumped. Unfortunately, many of them were found skeletonized. So there's not forensic evidence. Some of them, you can't even determine the exact cause of death, only homicidal means. So we could not say they're all linked. And some people are like pretty mad, like, what do you mean? And because you look at a case like that we just talked about, Lisk, where you had one that wasn't linked, and especially when you're dealing with very high risk victims as well. So we really have to base our analysis on what evidence do we have to make that assessment. And so, I may have a personal opinion and like, yeah, I think this is probably true, but without something to back it up. So in writing any reports that I would write at BAU, if I made a statement, I had to back that up with evidence or with research or something. Everything has to be backed up. And it's not about not necessarily not wanting to go out on a limb. It's just making sure that I'm stating something that I can back up with some kind of research or evidence or witness statement or something.
Yeah, and we appreciate that. I think that this is one of those cases that a lot of people start speculating, and you can go down a rabbit hole and create, just one theory after another. Do you think that another question that I kind of had was the particular day, choosing a day where the family, you know, all leaves and is gone to the Christmas party? I assume that the killer, picked that day because the Ramseys were going to be gone, or do you think that he had picked that day and he was going to break in regardless? I know that that's a lot of speculation on your part, but
Well, I'd also interject, Cameron, really quickly. The idea of the Christmas party as well. We're back to the plot of Die Hard again. I mean, we're back to the Christmas party. The film is taking place during the Christmas party, and there's the whole, the guy who's deriving this pleasure from sending everybody, law enforcement, on this complete wild goose chase, while his real kind of the whole thing just feels like so meta. Thinking about the actual kind of parallel, where as if he's like weaving a story that's kind of that's nodding us towards like an act of misdirection, while also kind of, like maybe there's conclusions we can draw from that desire to kind of misdirect to begin with. But it's so strange to me the way that so many of these things seem to be kind of referential to these other stories that exist, to get a sense of like, is the story that he's attempting to tell, is this all sarcastic, or is this like a kind of, is the meaning derived from the parallel itself, or does that have nothing to do with it? It's just, I don't have a specific question there. It's just kind of maddening, because that's the whole plot of like Die Hard. We have that Die Hard reference right away in the letter, and that's also, it's many people consider Die Hard, we're in the Christmas season right now, a Christmas movie, specifically because there's these Christmas references. It takes place at the night of a Christmas party. It's all of that.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I guess I would just have to say, I think it's most likely that he was going to commit this crime, whether they went out that night or not. So he had picked this day and they happened to go out. Maybe he saw that they went out and he went in and, waited until they were settled, or he came in afterwards. I don't know, but I think this day was probably the day, no matter whether they went to a party or not.
yeah.
And I'm going to base that on, I want to explain why I would base that on.
No, go ahead.
So it's been my experience with sex offenders that they get somewhat tunnel vision when they know they're going to have an opportunity to offend or meet up with a child. So much so sometimes they don't always make rational decisions. They're not paying attention to potentially surveillance. And so I think this person likely said in their mind that this was the day that they were going to do it. And that's what I base it on. It's kind of, it's not strong evidence, but it's just based on my own experience with child sex offenders.
So speaking of which, do you think this person has reoffended since, JonBenét?
Probably, yes.
And I assume you believe this person is still alive?
Yeah, statistically, they're very likely to be alive, yes.
And I mean, he asked if you believe the person is living like a paranoid life. Does this affect people like that? Or are they just kind of going about their day? It always reminds me of like Dennis Rader when you hear him testify in court about his murders, and he starts calling them cases, and he's just, like one by one, nonchalantly talking about these horrific crimes. And it's like, you don't even care.
Yeah. I like to believe that all these murderers out there are just always looking over their shoulder, just waiting to get caught. They're paranoid, they're miserable. They every knock on the door, it's the police, we've got you, we've got your DNA, especially now with forensic genetic genealogy. I like to believe that, but as you just pointed out, they don't feel the way we would feel, the guilt, the shame, the remorse that would be overwhelming to any of us that committed an unspeakable crime. And, this person chose to do that, so they don't think like the normal person. So do I think this is eating them up, and they may think, I could get caught someday. Someday they're going to be able to separate that DNA. And maybe they think like that, but I don't think that they have the feelings that we would want them to have, the suffering that we hope that they would have, unfortunately.
Do you think this is an individual that likely interjected themselves at any point in this investigation, maybe early on? I mean, I guess I'm just thinking specifically about the way that Richard Allen made that phone call to the police and said, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that I was in the park that day, and I'm just kind of coming forward," and using that as a kind of, at least initially, as a kind of cover, that he was just trying to be forthright and just kind of and helpful. Do you think that that's likely in this case based on maybe some of the other indicators, or not?
Yes, I think it's possible, and I wouldn't go so far as to say I think they called up and made any kind of admissions or any statements, but I believe they likely followed the case closely. And because of the fact that they could have a tie to the Ramseys, it's likely they were interviewed by the police, or they could have been interviewed by the police as well, and were involved in that way. Now, do I think they necessarily interjected themselves? I don't know, but they likely followed it closely. But it wouldn't surprise me if they did.
What do you think is going to close this case?
DNA. Well, I hope it does. So, I mean, there are two thought processes. Now, with the DNA, it was found in multiple areas. It is the same person's DNA. Unfortunately, it's a mixture. And my understanding, I was not a DNA analyst, but it's a 50-50 mixture. And they're not at the point where they can separate that out. What they can do is, which is the needle in the haystack, and what they've been doing over the years, is going and getting a suspect's DNA and making a direct comparison. But to do forensic genetic genealogy, they need to be able to separate that mixture out, which is why they haven't been able to do it yet. Now, technology, I believe, will hopefully make that possible to do someday.
So
I don't know.
Optum and private labs can't do that either?
Not at this point. That's my understanding. I think Bodie is doing the testing. So until that can be done, and some people believe that's contamination, and I don't think it is, but it's possible it could be contamination. And then if that's the case, then we have no DNA. At least from what publicly I know at this point. I mean, I know there's been additional testing on items, and I don't know the results of those. But so I don't know the status if they have other areas of DNA on different items. But from what I do know, it's a mixture, and it can't be separated at this point.
And that's
What
a
do you
pretty
think about
grueling.
Go ahead, Brian.
I would say that's a pretty grueling process to do those one-to-one comparisons, if that's what you're
Yes.
left with. I mean, yeah, I can't imagine. That sounds like, I mean, you mentioned just the number of interviews, or if we can call them persons of interest, from then till now, it's got to be hundreds and hundreds of people. And so, and I'm assuming
Yeah.
that not all of those people they were able to do that one-to-one test with as well. And so it's that's a really, because they're going to have to meet some threshold to do that test if the person doesn't volunteer it, right? So,
Right.
yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
like
it's kind of a needle in a haystack. Maybe not quite that ominous, but to do that, and that's all they can do at this point. So, but I mean, if it's going to be solved, I should say, if it's going to be solved, it will be solved with the DNA. Now, if that's contamination, then, we're left with nothing. And then that would be, we'd have to rely on some kind of deathbed confession, or this offender told someone else and that person comes forward at some point. So,
What do you make about the Boulder Police Department making comments about how they're close to the, I guess, charging someone?
well, they make a statement this time of year, I think every year. So, I mean, it's, but they're still engaged, and I'm always optimistic. I mean, I hope that is true, but I also know, I don't know. They make a statement every year, so I'm hopeful every year.
Yeah, and I think
And I'm
everyone
always
is.
hopeful. Like, just
Right.
generally, that's my nature with these cases. I've seen so many cases that I thought would never be solved get solved. And so I always remain hopeful. Even if you don't have DNA, I've seen a case from 1978 get solved because somebody called in, gave a name, and they went back, found a fingerprint that was at the crime scene, and they were able to match it to somebody, a fingerprint of all things. And so I really thought that was going to be a tough case to solve, and they solved it. And so I see this time and time again. So I'm always hopeful. And I do believe that every passing day they're getting closer. Technology's getting closer. I believe
Yeah,
that.
and you're absolutely right. And, one of the people that we found in our book was serial killer Terry Hyatt, where he had gone over 20 years without being caught. And then his friend decided to go into the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office drunk and started telling about murders that he had been, committed with Terry. So it does happen.
It
And
does.
yeah, and it would not surprise me if someone knew about, or if they told someone or confided in someone.
That's
But
what I'm really curious about. I was just thinking about, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Cameron, but I was
yeah,
just
go
thinking
ahead.
about the other day I was listening to, it was, I think it's one of, it was a cousin of Ted Bundy's just wrote a book recently, and she was describing just her experiences growing up with him, and beyond just the kind of stereotype of the double life that he led that's been talked about exhaustively. She looked at, like, in retrospect, there were these moments that where she saw him interacting with her friends that they had conversations about that really bothered her at the time. And there are these little things, and she described watching him, for instance. They were at a party together drinking, and he was slow dancing with a friend. And she said she saw his eyes get really dilated, and he was kind of not rough with her, but she yelled at him, like, "What are you doing to my friend?" And she saw him visibly snap out of it. And she wrote about that and other experiences with him. And I'm wondering if this individual, like you're saying, if there's something similar. Maybe they haven't directly confided that there's someone in their life, like maybe they don't know it's JonBenét, but there's something not quite right with this person.
Every time. So there's so many cases out there, and you both know this, where somebody commits a murder 20, 30 years ago, and they never do anything again. And then they get arrested, and everybody's like, "Wow, they were so normal. They had a family." And I never buy that. Never. There's always something. Now, is it enough that people would start suspecting? I think that, my husband is a murderer. No, or my husband is the serial killer. He's, the Long Island serial killer. I don't think that, where that necessarily. But when you go back, and if these people were to be honest with you about the behavior they witnessed or potential abuse they suffered at the hands of this person, whether it's physical, emotional, verbal, whatever, you are going to have problems. Their coworkers are going to have noticed things, whether they're ultra controlling. I believe there's always signs, and maybe nobody ever suspected they were a murderer or they were a serial killer, but there are always signs, in my opinion. And for some people to say, boy, he was just perfect in every single way and never showed any signs, I don't believe it. They just weren't looking, or they're lying. But there's
Well,
always going to be something. But
right.
is it enough to call someone and turn them in for murder? No, that's just not our first thoughts as human beings. We just don't think that way necessarily. Maybe some of us do. But
Right.
but generally we don't think that about the people that we love until you go back, like Ted Bundy's cousin, and say, I did notice some strange things despite this persona, this perfect guy, handsome guy. I didn't think he was particularly handsome, but some people, I guess, thought he was. I thought he was creepy. I thought he totally looked like a serial killer. I would have picked him out. But to be serious, I think, you go back and you do see those behaviors. If you're being honest and you're being open to, maybe I missed some things, and it's not to blame anybody for not catching that, because these types of crimes are rare, and most people, even if they have terrible behavior, aren't murderers. But I always think there's something there that would indicate possible violent tendencies.
And I would think that there'd be some type of conflict between this person and John, where people may have picked up on it.
Well,
especially if
people
it's
may have
something at
picked up
work.
on it. Yeah, people may have picked up on it. He may have picked up on it, but John may not have picked up on it. This is a
Right.
so what's interesting, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because there's a point in the note, I'm not going to rifle through now, but where he says something about you will be under scrutiny, and which the word should be surveillance. Like police are watching you, you'll be under scrutiny, should be under it should be under surveillance because the police would be watching. And so I just thought that was an interesting choice of words, and I thought it was potentially leakage. This person scrutinizes John. It was such a interesting word choice, in my opinion. And I wondered if this person just has these feelings toward John, and John has no idea that this person felt this way about him or was scrutinizing him. And it could be because of John's position. It could be because John didn't have a strong connection with this person, maybe wasn't their direct boss or had a direct link to him. But this person certainly knew John, knew who he was, and was scrutinizing him. So that's just interesting. It was just an interesting choice of words, and I thought it was leakage.
Okay. Well, I think we kind of covered this, but I'm putting it up there. Let me ask you this. What are the reasons we believe John was a target outside of JonBenét? And I think that we covered that with just the letter in general, how it's more addressed towards him and not JonBenét, right?
Yeah, and I think this person had animosity toward John, felt inferior to John, and that might be the motive. That's why he had, this, like, what I think is probably hatred of John, and for what he stood for as well. He was successful. I think John represented to this offender everything the offender wasn't. And I think that's where this stemmed from. I don't think John did anything personally to him. The one thing I want to say about John Ramsey is that, and a lot of people, they just put characteristics on him that just don't bear out. When you look at the interviews of people who worked for him, their friends, their family members, John, they were very well liked, and he was well thought of. There's no indication that he was verbally, emotionally, sexually, physically abusive to anyone. All of that has just been placed upon him, and it's unfairly placed upon him. And so I don't believe John, based on all the descriptions about him from the witnesses that were interviewed that knew him, would have any idea he would have done anything or done anything personally to this particular offender. He wouldn't have needed to upset or offend or make this person feel the way that they did about John. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I think some people get this sense about John. Well, he was a businessman, so he was cold, calculating, cruel guy, and they just, put characteristics. Same with Patsy Ramsey being involved in the pageant world. Characteristics were placed upon them, that just really did not bear out when you really look at what people had to say about them who knew them well at the time.
Right.
Characteristics were placed on them, and then he's also adopting a kind of villainous character himself in the letter. And I guess I'm wondering, like you mentioned earlier, that if this is about the sexual assault plus John Ramsey as well, is it after if the letter is, if the letter is written while he's there after JonBenét's death, do you feel like that it was because that pleasure was fulfilled in terms of murdering her, and he's able to think in a more directed, focused way towards John Ramsey, or towards interpreting kind of what this is about, essentially, by writing the letter and directing it towards him? Or is there maybe another way to think about that?
So I don't want to put too much weight on this person's rational thought. What I think, bottom line, was they were just trying to extend their gratification and their fantasy. It was just a way they accomplished what they wanted to accomplish with the sexual murder of JonBenét. And they realized, I don't want this to end, and I can further hurt John by writing this letter and directing it toward him and making him believe, number one, that he can save his daughter, and number two, if he doesn't do what I said, it's his fault that she's dead. And I think that is the way that I view it. Mm-hmm. And I don't go much beyond that with this particular offender. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
It does. So that way, so it's not that they're like two separate things, that they're so totally intertwined in your mind in that way, in the sense that in the sexual fantasy with JonBenét is also, is about the fact that she's a young child, but it's also intertwined with him too.
Yes. Yes, I think it is. I think it's kind of a 2-for-1, to be completely blunt about it. And I mean, and I think the colleagues that I did the analysis with, not only of the letter, but of the crime itself, I think they would agree with me that this was an opportunity to accomplish two things. And, I also want to just point out, which we didn't really talk about too much, was, a lot of emphasis have been placed on JonBenét being part of these pageants. And while that may have been a consideration, I don't think this offender was like particularly obsessed with JonBenét as a victim. I think the obsession was more with John, and he was a pedophile, because what you don't see is any mention of JonBenét in the letter, and as far as her name, or, you would think if it was all about JonBenét, the letter would focus on that, or at least at some point that fantasy would leak up or leak out in the letter. And we don't see that at all. We don't even see her mentioned.
That's a really good point, and one that I haven't spent that much time thinking about, is that you don't see her actual name in there.
Right. Not once.
Yeah. Which, if you
always
had
your daughter.
Right. Yeah. It's more general.
And it's all John. You see his name multiple times.
Does it tell us anything about the offender, given that this does the kind of third party kind of passive nature of this, in the sense that I want to harm John by basically getting to him through a third party? Now, granted, there's like a lot of psychological damage that can be done through what he does, but it still is, he's still striking out against John in a very indirect way.
Yes. Yes, I think that's a very good point that you're making. I agree totally that, and to translate that into regular life, this is somebody who would be very passive aggressive. in their dealings. And like I said, John may not even know that this person didn't like him or was upset with him or had some kind of grievance against him. He wouldn't necessarily know that because this person is not someone who's going to confront him directly. So yes, you make a very good point about it being passive. As brutal and as horrific as the entire crime is, it's still indirect in a way. As much as it directly impacted John Ramsey and his family, it was a very indirect way to get at him. You're absolutely right.
And in that way, even the movie references become indirect. I mean, they're indirect language as well. He's talking about, he's doing these things for all the reasons we said potentially, but it's also addressing the kind of crime and all this in a very kind of indirect way again.
Yes. Right. Yeah. We'll make a profile out of you.
Put him in the academy.
Yeah.
Just-
It's good.
So, yeah, I mean that's a very good behavioral observation of that I think could be missed as well, but I think it's a very good point.
English professors care about language very much too, so that's our forte.
Yes. I mean, you probably know the linguistics of this much better than I do. I mean, I know, like I said, I just do the basics. I saw the switch in the pronouns and the inconsistencies and the word choices, but generally, it would be interesting to, and I know this, I don't believe this was ever done, but, just to go through, and it might have been done. There's probably somebody out there that did it, but I don't know officially, to really go through and, with a forensic linguist's eye and just really draw out all the idiosyncrasies of the way that they write, the way they structure their sentences, all of that, because those are things that, you may be able to hide in the first couple paragraphs, but you're not going to be able to hide, in a 3-page letter. I keep calling it a note. I'm going to call it a letter. So.
And I can't remember if I asked you this before, but were you able to see the other drafts of the letter?
So no, I feel that at some point I saw a copy of the beginning of one of them. It wasn't like the drafts were just like he addressed it first to Mr. and Mrs. and then decided, abandoned that plan, which goes to show that I don't think there was a plan in place. So this is something my colleague pointed out, which was another reason why I also came to the conclusion I think it was written after. I just think it was an afterthought to write the letter because they didn't have a plan. And they originally addressed the first letter to Mrs. and Mrs. and then abandoned that, threw it in the garbage, and then ended up writing this one. And I think there was another draft as well. I could be wrong, but I want to say there might have been 2 at some point. So I believe I've seen maybe a copy somewhere of the first one, but I can't remember for sure.
So spending the time to write, multiple drafts and whatnot, is there a,
well, he didn't write multiple drafts.
Or start.
He just started, like he just started just the beginning and decided this is just to John, not to Mrs. and Mrs. Ram. He got rid of that. There was never like a lot of time to start a draft and decide halfway through. It wasn't anything like that. It was like the beginning and then thrown away. I guess you can call that a draft, but it was, there was no thought.
So these may be him like trying to get his thoughts together and he messed this up and like who he was going to actually address, I think was at the point where he abandoned the drafts. Yeah, and I guess they left one of the drafts, or part of it was left in the notepad, right? And it was Patsy's notepad, right? I think there was also a draft in the garbage as well. Okay. I think. I knew that was kind of one of the. I saw the comment there, but yeah, I think there might have been one in the notepad as well,
just like your commenter just said, and I think there was one in the garbage.
So I'm trying to hit some of these. So some of the comments were about Patsy. I know that was one of the people that in the media was thrown out, maybe responsible because it was her notepad, and it did, it sounded just so cinematic, and using the attaché, which I think you talked about this in your podcast, Al. She was really into French culture, and so, especially, JonBenét and whatnot. So maybe that pointed to her, but you don't believe that this is Patsy was responsible,
No.
right? Okay.
I do not. No.
Just wanted to
I don't
clarify
believe
that.
either Ramsey is responsible. And I shouldn't say either, any Ramsey is responsible for this. And I know that people strongly disagree with that, but that is my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm just going to hit on some of these comments while we're closing it up. 118,000. I mean, this was 118,000 in 96. So, I mean, that was
So this commenter, I think they said earlier something about a 13-year-old boy. So what I think is interesting is that I don't think you could rule that out. And
about it being a younger kid.
yeah, I don't think you can necessarily. Now, statistically,
There you go.
likely not.
Or neighbor's kid.
Yes. That was I was going to say. But somebody that had eyes on the house. And what I will tell you, I don't think every single person who was in the neighborhood or visiting a house has that they were all identified at the time. I'm not sure about a neighborhood canvas. Number one thing you would want to do is do a neighborhood canvas that morning, go to every single house, find out every single person who lived in that house or who was visiting that house at that time, get all their names. I'm not sure that was done. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was not done. But it always struck me that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, that the Ramseys were out that night. And did this person, were they able to see the house and see when they would come and go? And somebody in the neighborhood, I mean, who knows if, Patsy talked about what John's bonus was, or who knows, but people talk, gossip. John Ramsey got $118,000 bonus. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that you cannot rule out potential younger offenders in the area. Yeah, I wouldn't. Not just based on, statistics, or I mean, teenage kids commit horrific crimes. We've seen that in some of our cases where, it's the kid right across the street. It's the strange kid in the neighborhood.
Right. And I meant breaking into that house too, if you were familiar with the area. I mean, just having so many access points. And I know that they did find the one broken window in the basement, but
yeah,
I'm sure that it wouldn't be that difficult to get into that house and not be noticed.
There were several doors and windows unlocked, despite John Ramsey thinking he locked everything. That is not the case. They went around, they found several areas where someone could have entered without actually breaking a window or
just walked right in.
Yep. Yeah. Even though he claimed that everything was locked up, it wasn't.
Yeah, and when you've got that many doors and windows and people coming and going and people working at the house, that's probably hard to keep track of.
Yeah. No, they couldn't. They had so many keys, they couldn't keep track of all the keys they gave out either. But like I said, a person wouldn't have needed a key.
Right. All right. Well, Brian, do you have anything else for Julia?
No, this is actually, it's been very educational for me. I'm not an expert on this case, but I do enjoy hearing other people talk about it though. So it's been interesting to hear.
Okay. Christmas light cords were running outside the front door of,
So it wasn't locked, or was?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
You
guess
could just
I'm
walk
just
right
struck
in.
by just the very different profiles. It seems like, I mean, just from the
I know,
idea
me
that
too.
that
Like,
that yeah, that
how could you think
the
anything else but what I
right.
think?
It's just kind
Just
of
kidding.
just the person the weirdo neighborhood kid, right, who would do this is like, I mean, in that case, you look at the letter as like, well, maybe there's some animosity against John Ramsey, but maybe it's just a misdirection, like you were saying, or is this like, like we were talking about earlier, as far as the potential employers and or employees and that might not have been aware that he felt that way. It just seems like such very different individuals. You can imagine it's a very difficult circumstance for law enforcement at this point, particularly if you're left with those one-to-one comparisons we were talking about earlier. It seems like a huge nightmare to have. And it's one of these cases. I was telling Cameron beforehand, and I should preface by just reminding I'm not like an expert on this case, and I'm sure there's people in the comments that know this case a lot better than I do, but it's a case that still surprises me that would come down to when I hear them talking about new advancements in genetic genealogy, like what was talked about at the press conference the other day. It just really surprises me that this would be a case that would come down to genetic genealogy. And I realized there were a lot of circumstances that had to get us to the point where we would be depending on that so much, but it still is, I think, just a very surprising circumstance to be in. And maybe that's part of the reason people were so interested in this case. So.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think that part of the reason why, and I don't want to, get on my soapbox too much, but the initial investigation, there's so many things that just didn't happen that should have happened. Like Julia was saying about doing a canvas, which that's a basic thing that police officers do when you have any type of major crime. That is, most mid-sized departments are going to have a departmental policy with a checklist of everything they do, and I promise you that canvas the scene is going to be in the top 5.
Yeah.
Well, and I was thinking about too. I know Colorado always says we have someone who's dedicated, whose primary job, they do other stuff, but is like looking at this case. But I kept thinking about, I know we've interviewed other cold case detectives before, and when they come onto a case, it's incredibly difficult to go back and just do that full case review as it is. And we've talked about just the number of persons of interest and the scope of this case. And it's nice that there's a single individual attached to it, but I can't from at least their end, but I just can't imagine what that looks like with just the size of what this case file would be at this point when this case is handed off to someone new, because this drags on for another period of time because we're not there technologically yet. That's especially if it's one name somewhere in this file potentially, like that's just a lot to catch up on, and it's challenging for cold case detectives in cases that are far less complex than this one. And it just I can't imagine.
Yeah. I can't either.
All right. Well, Julia, I appreciate you coming on again.
Thank you.
Make sure everyone goes and checks out the consult. Sorry, that's a bad picture, but that is available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere where you can get a podcast. You can also go to their website and get cool merch like this hoodie here, the consult. So make sure you do that. And Brian, do you want to tell them about your website, briansantanaauthor.com?
Yeah, briansantanaauthor.com. I have a mailing list if you're interested in all the different projects that I'm starting and then abandoning, and also just other things that are coming up with articles and other things related to our work on Murder on Campus, Professor to Cop in North Carolina's most notorious cold case, the Virginia Olsen case. There we go.
Yeah, you stole my thunder on that one, but
Okay.
if everyone can like and subscribe to Santana True Crime, you can follow me on Instagram and other social media at Santana True Crime. And you can also pick up our book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor of the Cop in North Carolina's most notorious cold case. Any more plugs before we go? Well, thank you for everyone for joining us in the chats. We will not be doing this Thursday, but next Thursday we'll have another live show. So make sure you tune in. Thank you all, and good night, and Merry Christmas.